Welcome to Exceptionally Speaking, the podcast where we explore how to better understand and support exceptional learners. I'm Dr. Meryl, and each week I sit down with dedicated educators, parents, and advocates to share real strategies, inspiring stories, and moments of hope. If you're enjoying these conversations or learning something new, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm joined by Torrye Parker, an education consultant, DEI strategist, and founder of Reimagining, an organization focused on advancing equity in education through culturally responsive teaching and policy reform. Torrye's work is deeply grounded in her lived experience and in her commitment to ensuring that all students, especially Black and Brown students, are seen, heard, and supported in public education. In this episode, Torrye shares her personal journey through public education, from attending a school as a child in a military family to becoming a teacher and now a powerful advocate working across education systems to challenge inequity. We talk about how racial bias, cultural mismatch, and outdated definitions of giftedness can create barriers for exceptional students, and what it takes to build schools that are truly inclusive. Torrye also shares her thoughts on the power of parent advocacy, community-led solutions, and the urgent need for teacher training in neurodiversity and equity. Her clarity, passion, and insight shine through in every part of this conversation. I really enjoyed it. You can find more about Torrye and all of our guests at hex24press.com. Please enjoy Exceptionally Speaking with Torrye Parker. Hey, Torrye, it's so good to see you.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to talk to you today, to talk about exceptional children and really dig into this. So I'd love to start with just sharing a little bit more about you. If you'd like to share about your background, really what led you to your work in educational equity and how that's informing what you're doing today.
Well, thank you, because as you know, this is so passionate to me because it's personal and professional for me. And so first, I think just starting with the story about me as a kid. And so I actually grew up in Department of Defense schools, and those are military schools. And we actually lived in Japan at the time. And so I did, pretty well there. I got straight A's, maybe like the B in math. I always got a B in math usually. I remember going back to the States. So I had spent 6 years in Japan, and we were headed back to the States. And we met with the guidance counselor to pick out my ninth grade classes. Previously, I had been in like honors classes, done really well, as I said before. And I remember the counselor just saying like, oh, we're going to put her in, gen ed classes. It's fine. But I think my parents were a little bit confused. Like, she's been in honors courses, like what's going on? And so that was sort of, my first sort of like experience, I think, really thinking about how racial bias can shape educational opportunity. And so for me, ever since that moment, I felt like I was just, even as a high school student, just kind of analyzing how I was treated compared to my peers. And so going to a predominantly white school, we still had a number of like Black and Latino kids in this school. But I remember just being, and by the way, I never told you that my parents actually advocated for me. And so I did end up going into those honors courses and later AP courses. But I was only one of like 3 students of color in those classes. And so it was always just kind of alarming, like, wait, why am I the only one there? And so for me, I think that experience shaped me so much. And so when I went to college, I eventually decided to become a teacher. And I think, again, those experiences in the classroom kind of shaped who I am today. And so I spent the past like 14 years in schools working as a middle school and high school English teacher, and then eventually went into administration. And then what I'm doing now is I'm a consultant. I work with students and families across the country. I think that really goes back to sort of why I wanted to become a consultant. I felt like, working in classrooms, I definitely was having an impact one-on-one with my students, with the families I interacted with, and with my, principals and other administrators. But I do think eventually I really wanted to see sort of more progress because, of course, from just like going to conferences, talking to other teachers, I knew this was a problem that was really widespread. And so for me now as a consultant, I work with schools and educational nonprofits all across the country to really think about, okay, how do we achieve equity? And for me, equity is, making sure that every student has an opportunity to thrive, both academically and socially in our schools. And so that was really important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you came back to the States, was that on the East Coast in the Virginia area as well? Or where was that when you came back to high school over here?
Yes, it was and so I currently reside in Northern Virginia, and that's where I reside today. And so it was the first time for me going to a public school, because again, I grew up in military Department of Defense schools. And so it was a wide, I think, sort of awakening for me because, the military families are pretty diverse. And so I had a lot of students who looked like me in my class, and then students from all different cultures. So I think going to high school, again, going to a predominantly white public school and just seeing just sort of the inequities, the stark reality of, wow, I'm one of the few, students of color in this honors class or this AP class. And then most of my friends who were students of color are in general ed classes, or what they called standard classes in Virginia at the time.
Yeah. And so, as you went through your educational career, teacher leader, and eventually moved on to consulting, what really prompted that change?
Yes, honestly, for me, it was that, I started actually teaching in 2007. And at the time, I worked in a predominantly Black and Latino population. And at the time, I think maybe many of my students might have been actually neurodivergent. I taught like, maybe 90 students a year. So just thinking back to all those years. And I think for me, the reason why I decided to leave like the classroom is because I felt like one of the gaps was really in terms of education, like just the teacher preparation. For me, especially, I would even think about my own teacher training. I don't think I was given the tools or the training to really understand like neurodivergent students, especially thinking about students with ADHD or autism. And so for me, I think, yeah, that training was missing. And so I really wanted to do that on a more national level and really advocate for that with school district leaders, with principals. And so that's what I do now as a consultant.
And so, in your consulting, what are you seeing as the major issues that are rising up for different schools and districts that you work with that are really common that you're having to dig into?
So I think one of the thinkers who really has shaped my understanding of this is Dr. Joy Lawson Davis. I'm not sure if you've heard of her. She's the
Oh,
author of
yeah, she's
Right,
great.
Talented and Black, and I think of quite a few other books. But really thinking about how so much of our sort of, thinking about the qualities that when schools and districts are looking at who, can be in the gifted and talented program, I think some of those qualities that you especially see with Black or Hispanic students don't always show up on the test, right? Again, like I think for even those students with ADHD, it's not that quiet compliance, like this, thought of like who is a good student in our schools, and it really to me shows up in the storytelling. It shows up in the leadership our students, show when they are, whether they're at recess, hanging out in the hallway or in the classroom, and also like just that deep curiosity and emotional intensity that's there too. I think without training, educators can just overlook some of those traits. Especially, I think when students are not part of the dominant, right? So they're not white or they're not middle class. And so for me, I think I loved how, especially from me reading Dr. Lawson Davis' work, is like she really talks about sort of the traits of especially like Black students, thinking about what their giftedness looks like, right? Thinking about like, how they're good at problem solving. Particularly, I think when those problems are shared with them, that are relevant to themselves and their community. And so and I think she speaks on culturally relevant teaching as well, and how important that is. And I think, again, so many educators just don't recognize some of that brilliance, some of that genius that is in Black and Latino communities, because they don't always match the traditional norms that we see with white students.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Lawson Davis is amazing, and I think everyone should read her work and really dig into the work that she's doing. Are you seeing across the districts and schools that you've supported through your consulting where people are looking for that kind of advice and support, or is this something that you end up showing them through your analysis of their work that this is an issue and that we are overlooking Black and Brown students for gifted identification, and here are some ways that we can do it? Interested just in what the perception has been as you've worked through that.
Yes, I would say it's a mixed bag. Sometimes I go into communities, and again, I work in my local area. So, like in what we call DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, but also across the country. So, I've actually done work out in Colorado, and I've also done work out in New Jersey, down south in Alabama. And when I think about sort of the reception I've been given, I think sometimes, schools are just like, oh my goodness, we need this. Like, we know how important it is. We know that we are missing the mark, right? We know that students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, are underrepresented, gifted, and talented programs, but also students with ADHD, or autism, or some different ability as well. And so for me, I think some of them are coming with like, please, please, we want to learn from you. And I think others, it's hard. It's hard for them to face the reality that they've actually been, marginalizing students in a way. And it's not always obviously on purpose. I don't think, well, often it is not on purpose. It's just these unconscious biases that can occur, right? And you got to be conscious of them. And so for me, I think about like a particular district which actually was heavily Black and Hispanic students, right? I'm talking about like 60, 70% of their student population. However, when we did an equity audit of their talented and gifted program, it was surprising because, I mean, it was mostly white and Asian students in that program. So I think, again, sometimes you go to a district and they're just, they haven't thought about it. It just hasn't hit their radar. But we know, often schools are busy, right? There's so many problems that they're tackling. So it just takes, sometimes that outside voice just to ask questions and to start to crunch and look at data. And so for me, I think it's been a mixed bag, but I do think 9 out of 10 times, once we do reveal like there's an equity there, everyone wants to roll up their sleeves and say, okay, what can we do? How can we combat this? How can we make sure that students are represented, students of all backgrounds are represented in our gifted and talented programs?
Yeah, it's definitely a topic of conversation in a gifted world, but often I'm pressing people to know, and what are you doing about it, right? There's a lot of talk about it, but it's what are you doing about it? We have all these tests that very well identify our white and Asian gifted students, but it's not doing the same for the rest of our student population. And so for me, that's a look at we need different assessments, right? The problem's not the students, the problem is the tools that we're using, but a lack of people willing to dig in and try something else. And so I'm glad to hear that people are willing to talk about it and really think with you as you do your work on how that can impact the schools and districts you work with. I'm curious what your experience has been as a parent and just within your family supporting and advocating for your students in public schools, and any advice you would have for parents as they're navigating the landscape.
I'm taking a deep sigh because before, of course, just advocating for students, just as a classroom teacher, as administrator, like it's just so, it hits you so much more. I mean, I care deeply about those kids, right? Sometimes we call them my kids. And just thinking about my own too, I have a second and fifth grader. One has actually been identified as gifted and talented, is in their gifted and talented program in their school. And then I have another child actually who has ADHD and anxiety. And it's so interesting to see and to think about how they've sort of been treated differently in the system. And, often I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that giftedness and ADHD can actually look very similar, right? And then obviously there's also like, it can both occur at the same time. When I think about in terms of even like things I've heard in parent teacher conferences or at IEP meetings. I'm like, yeah, she's really, really smart. But, I don't know if she would, make it in the gifted and talented program, because she's just so high energy, the emotional sensitivity, it might be too much for her. And so for me, that is just a sort of a sign that, again, that there needs to be a lot more education in our schools. And again, I want to just say, because I'm a former classroom teacher, and just so you know, like when I started teaching, I did not know anything about this. There's so much I had to learn. And sometimes, of course, the schools I was working at, they offered the training, or sometimes I just had to like actually go out there and find it myself. So I also want to say I so respect teachers, and I know they're juggling so much. So to me, this means like we need to do more at the school district level to make sure that teachers are getting these resources and are learning more about what is ADHD, autism, just different abilities look like in the classroom, right? And sort of how does that go, in terms of giftedness as well. So I think, again, for me, I think just as a mother, I've just seen the tension that twice exceptional students live with. I mean, to just pull between so many in terms of strengths and challenges. I think people wanting to focus on their challenges and their areas for growth more. And I think it's so interesting to me how sometimes these students are labeled and disciplined, right? And just thinking about like the behavior more so than the why behind the behavior to me. And so again, I just think and I see how, personally as a mom, how twice exceptional students with ADHD struggle with low self-esteem because they're just so constantly misunderstood. They're corrected probably way more than they're celebrated in the classroom. And even thinking about just remarks that I've heard, just, going, to different school activities and hearing people talk about maybe a certain kid. That kid is, did you hear about what that kid did? And I know in terms of just personally that kid's in the gifted program, I'm thinking like, that's actually what gifted can look like sometimes if you only knew, right? And so again, I think one of the important things is to just make sure that we're educating ourselves as parents. Definitely, there's so many communities that you can become a part of that has actually been helpful for me, so you can feel less alone as a parent of someone who is gifted, who has ADHD, and also just as Black parents of Black children, I think it's helpful to just not do this alone, to definitely get in community. There are, of course, online communities, but there's some import groups too that have been really helpful. And I think for me, just thinking about in general, what does it mean to be an ally? And so for thinking about white parents and families in particular, like what can you do to speak up and to just educate yourself about this, right? Because usually it can't just be, in terms of, families of color fighting the system against this. Right? And I think about that just to go larger, just thinking about if you are a parent of a neurodivergent child or children, right? Like what does that look like? You're always having to fight and like always like going into conference after conference. So what does it look like for your peers who maybe have neurotypical children, right, to join you in that and to advocate for you and to just educate themselves about the issue?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point and something that I find very frustrating, and I know you see it across schools and districts, is this very antiquated idea of what giftedness is. And I think it ties into what you were talking about regarding really systemic failure to prepare our teachers, and that hasn't changed either. And so without that change, and while there is some sprinkling of more gifted information, it's really selective by college prep program whether or not they even talk about it. And then we zoom out to like which states even fund gifted at all. Those universities in those states are a little bit more likely to talk more about what it means to be gifted. How does that show up across our student populations? But when there's no money tied to the support, I have seen people check out so quickly. And I'm wondering what your experience has been around the, there's no money for that, so we don't really care, like that kind of attitude, and how you combat.
Yes, it is incredibly challenging. And I think for me, what I see when I'm, doing, I do a lot of audits. And so just going in, mapping out like what's here, what are some of the strengths here, and then also thinking about opportunities and gaps in these systems. And I think about how there are just so many just competing factors and competing priorities. But for me, ultimately, when we go back to like what are we all here for, right? It is to make sure that every student, regardless of their background, regardless of sort of their abilities, their race, their ethnicity, their income level, or their parents' income level, that they should have an opportunity to thrive. And so for me, when they're like, oh, well, we can't focus on students with ADHD or we can't focus on that, I'm thinking, well, actually, many of these policies are going to help us all students in general. So like, not only will like your teachers feel more educated, but these strategies that they might use with a neurodivergent child or a culturally responsive strategy they might use for a Black and Latino child, like that's actually going to be helpful for every student in the classroom. So for me, it's like, how can we work smarter, not harder, right? And thinking about that. But I will say, like, I mean, the challenges are real on the ground in terms of just teachers are already taxed with so much in terms of like lesson planning and just trying to differentiate in the classroom with so many different abilities. And so I do think, of course, that's when I will say as a consultant, I do a lot of work within the schools, but sort of outside of that, just sort of as a community member and parent, I'm like constantly advocating at the state and at the national level for more funding because ultimately, everyone says like, well, money is not going to solve everything. That is true, but it's going to actually help us go a little further faster in terms of getting that education, getting teachers sort of more time, especially thinking about those teachers who have heavy caseloads in terms of special education, right? In terms of the IEP meetings that they're having, giving them actually just time to have a substitute, right? To really think meaningfully about the IEP plans that they're making and to get more training. And so I think that's important too. And so for me, it's like that advocacy for sure. I'm like this, if every parent could just spend time, like whether it's like a quick note to a state senator or to a congressperson at the national level, I think it would be really helpful for them to see that like, actually, no, we want this, we care about this, and we've got to, do better by our students. They deserve better.
Yeah. And like you said, that idea of money's not going to change everything. No, however, we have wild caseloads going on right now. Wild for special ed and for worse and gifted because there is no caseload calculator. It's just whatever districts want to do. And sometimes that looks like zero specialist support. So I agree that, like, yes, we get it. It's not going to change everything, but we do need to humanize our teacher workforce in a way that's like these are real people who care so much about the work that they're doing, and we're giving them impossible jobs, and then we're wondering why kids are failing. You
That's
know?
so true. I know. I actually just thought about something else too, in terms of so little. Actually, I'm in the middle of doing a curriculum audit actually for a talented and gifted program, and I'm thinking about in terms of just the amount of like work that needs to go into like just planning a lesson, just one lesson, right? In order to really meet these kids' needs, is like it takes time, right? And it takes skill level. And again, if we could get more teachers actually that planning time to plan meaningfully, right? And so that the students are actually not sitting in class bored or like what we often hear from gifted students, not challenged enough, right? So I think it takes time to actually put into that the curriculum, right, and to do that well. And also, in the other lens is thinking about culturally responsive curriculum, right? How can we make sure we have a curriculum that's speaking to different backgrounds, in particular, thinking about our Black and Latino students, right? And all the research will show that they actually need some of those cultural archetypes in the curriculum in order to really learn, right? And to feel safe to learn in the first place, right? To feel connected. And so that's important too. So it takes time to do that curriculum work. And just someone who's actually been a curriculum director before, like literally the time it takes to putting together meaningful lessons is a lot. And so again, our teachers need space for that.
Yeah, we can have such a beautifully created curricula, but if teachers don't have the time to learn it and actually use it the way it's intended, it's a waste of time for everyone. I would love to hear a success story around your consulting work, maybe a situation where you came into it and the product was the school really had a mindset shift in how they're supporting their students, something that we can share with our listeners that will really give them hope as they move forward with this work.
Yes, so there are definitely bright spots out there that keep me going, especially in terms of just thinking about all the challenges we face in education. I think one shift in particular for me is that some schools are really, really starting to understand that giftedness is not just about IQ or grades. And so to me, I love when I am hearing like any educator talk to me about like asynchronous development. I'm like, yes, right. Just recognizing that our students can be behind in one area, right? But then I'm way ahead in another, and just sort of thinking about that and changing their process, knowing that, like, in terms of like, it can't just be looking at grades, some of the testing scores, and like a teacher referral, because again, we can talk about like sort of how those things can be biased, right? And so just thinking about like holistically, how can we look at this whole child? How can we make sure? I mean, there were districts who weren't actually getting any input from family or caregivers. So to me, I'm like, yes, add that, right? Make sure that if possible, right, depending on time, you can actually interview and kind of get to know the student and do observations. And so just adding more. And so I know obviously that can be hard again because of time, but those who took the time to do that, I think, they're seeing that, okay, there's so many things that we weren't capturing because of the test. And just making sure, of course, there's universal screening. Again, there were school districts not doing that, right? And so just making sure that, like, we're not going to just, have only students that maybe teachers refer take this test, to get into our gifted and talented program, but we're going to just go ahead and do universal screening. These are just like things that should be happening. But to me, I think what I see that is really, really meaningful are those, to me, some of the curriculum pieces that are being put in place for gifted and talented students. So really thinking about like, okay, what can we do to make sure they're they're diving deeply into topics, right? That they are being able to work with, like, we have mentors coming in. So people from the community, whether that's from like a STEM field or from the arts community, journalism community, they're coming in and they're helping them to do independent projects and really kind of diving into their passion. So what I would say is like that kind of personalized learning that is really great for these learners. And so I've been so impressed to see just some like people who are really going above and beyond. And there's some programs out there too where students are able to like kind of do, I mean, for lack of better words right now, like this work study program where they're actually going to like work with, scientists in the field or some business people and like just artists, like where they're really able to do that. And so they're getting really innovative with the way scheduling works to give those students those opportunities to, again, to dive deep into their passions, right, to discover different things. And so that's really, really exciting stuff that's happening out there for sure.
That's great. And I'm wondering, what advice could we give teachers who are aware of this idea of a cultural mismatch where their culture does not match their students and yet they're being asked to provide feedback about how they're showing up in the classroom, how they are really just operating on a day-to-day basis, maybe unknowingly realizing they are a gatekeeper and could be a gatekeeper in that situation, don't want to operate in that way. So what kinds of open-ended questions could we present for teachers to really think through as they're thinking about their students?
Yes, to me, it's just to think about like sort of what just assumptions am I making about this student? I think, I remember just being a classroom teacher again, especially having like 30 students in a class, maybe if you're pulling students or, you have a separate class for the gifted and talented, maybe you have maybe 20, I mean, 15, who knows? For me, it's like really just sitting there and thinking about like, well, what assumptions am I making about this student? And sort of like, what does that have to do? And to me, it's actually more about the personal reflection, like sort of what am I bringing into this? Like, what are stories that I've told myself, like all these years about sort of how a student with ADHD can do, right? Or what a student with autism can do, or what a Black or Latino student can do. Like, what are some of the images I've seen in the media? Like, what are some of the stories I've just been telling myself? So, like, really digging and kind of doing some of that sort of personal reflection. And then obviously going into, like, what assumptions am I bringing into the classroom? Like, about that, and sort of what are my colleagues sort of talking, and like how do I talk about a student, and sort of do I actually believe that they can do this, right? I think it's so interesting because there you can go into some schools, and I have done this, and there have been like teachers who say like, oh well, yeah, we don't really have gifted kids here, and I'm thinking, no, like there are gifted kids everywhere. So like no matter what school environment you are in, there's a gifted kid here, I am for sure, right? And so just I think to me, once you started to ask yourself those questions and to really educate yourself, right? And I think, again, because I know time is of the essence, it's like really in terms of whether it's like, okay, maybe I can be a part of a book club, right? Maybe there's not something happening locally here, but there could be something online that I could be a part of. And perhaps it's like just listening to different podcasts like this one, that can help you. So I think really once you've done that personal reflection, then start thinking outward to like, okay, how are these assumptions showing up in my classroom with how I treat my students, how I talk about my students, how my colleagues talk about our students, and then like educating yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that self-reflection is huge, and even just the recognition that we don't know everything, and that we definitely don't know everything about our students and what their morning was even like this morning before they got to school, right? We don't know everything. And so to just open it up and say, I'm going to be aware that I have the biases. Everyone has biases. I'm going to be aware that they're there and trying to recognize them and see how that is affecting how you're interacting with your students, or who you're referring for gifted. Where's your list of students that you referred for gifted, and to really look at them and say, okay, is this through a biased lens or not? What other information do I need to understand about my students to make that best decision? I think that's super helpful. So just as we wrap up, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I'm going to post your info on hex24press.com, but would just love to give you an opportunity to talk any more about Reimagine and where people can find you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I am often busy, so I don't post on social media or LinkedIn as much, but definitely you can go to reimagineconsultinggroup.org, and find out more about my work there. I work with an awesome group of other consultants who, again, we care deeply about equity. We care deeply about making sure that every student has the opportunity to thrive, both academically and socially in our schools and our communities. And so I think for me, I'm often just traveling to different school communities or educational nonprofits and just really helping them think through all of this. I think what's most important in my work is making sure that as we are designing and thinking of these solutions and talking about this, that we must, design with the community that we're, designing for and thinking about. And so for me, it's so important to make sure that, especially when we're talking about students, to include students in the conversation, right? To have like youth-led solutions. And so for me, I think it's important in any work I do. I'm like, how can I co-design? Right, but of course, teachers who are on the ground, who are working with students every day, but also students, particularly, I mean, even you'll see some upper elementary school students are able to articulate and talk about these things for sure. But definitely middle school and high school students has been amazing. I think some of the most eye-opening insights I have into thinking about, how students with ADHD struggle with, in terms of like, are they gifted? Like, can they be in a gifted and talented program? Or even thinking about Black and Latino students is like actually hearing from them in empathy interviews. And I'm just always amazed. So one thing I've actually always said is like shadow a student, or really just think about that student's day and like just talk with the student about these things, obviously, and talk to the families about it as well. And I feel like you learn so much from that. So that's what like my our consulting work is deeply grounded in, making sure that we are doing like kind of a needs assessment and we're hearing from the community before we think about solutions with schools at the district or the school principal level. We want to hear from the community first.
Absolutely. I think that is a huge piece that's missing in a lot of new designs, is community driven, youth led programs, and people not coming in and assuming what students need in a particular community or school, and really listening. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I think it's really important. And I hope that we get to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me, Meryl.
Thanks, Torrye. This episode of Exceptionally Speaking is brought to you by Hex24 Press, where education meets imagination. I founded Hex24 Press in 2024 to uplift educator voices and provide a publishing home for myself and other educators to bring our work into the world. You can find more information about today's guests, including links to their resources and services, at hex24press.com. Thank you for supporting educators, independent creators, and small business. We're so glad you're here.